The confrontation at Stalingrad stands as among the most pivotal encounters throughout the Second World War. The carnage witnessed during this clash and the decisive triumph achieved by Soviet forces undoubtedly represented a crucial juncture in the global struggle. Following this savage engagement, the destiny awaiting roughly 100,000 German troops who endured the ferocity of the Red Army proved no more promising than their fallen comrades. Their existence within Soviet prison camps became characterized by anguish from compulsory work and relentless hours of what seemed perpetual suffering. Today, dear viewers, we shall examine the experiences of these warriors following Germany's collapse at Stalingrad. Throughout the initial phases of the Second World War, the Nazi regime had successfully conquered critical battlegrounds, including Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Calculating the fatalities from these three campaigns, German forces sustained less than 100,000 casualties, while managing to inflict double the losses upon enemy armies. Such statistics proved remarkably promising and encouraged Adolf Hitler to intensify efforts and contemplate striking a target he had long coveted. The Soviet Union appeared as quite a formidable objective for multiple reasons. Firstly, its geographical vastness exceeded 22 million square kilometers. France encompassed roughly 640,000, Poland extended to 320,000, while the Netherlands scarcely exceeded 40,000. Despite favorable outcomes achieved across these European nations, conquering every portion of Soviet terrain seemed unreasonable. Furthermore, the strength of the Red Army throughout what they termed the Great Patriotic War witnessed 5 million warriors equipped with armaments that surpassed those of multiple European forces combined. Additionally, there existed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a neutrality agreement concluded between Germany and the Soviet Union during the night of August 23rd to 24th, 1939, wherein both parties pledged mutual non-aggression. Nevertheless, Adolf Hitler's aspirations exceeded any logic that might obstruct his path. Following his involvement in the First World War, the German dictator maintained profound animosity toward the Soviet state and Bolshevism. Through conquering this realm, he could forestall another British blockade, while avoiding famine resembling that experienced after the earlier major conflict. Hitler's plan involved entering Soviet lands several months sooner, but the crucial Greek invasion postponed the schedule. This considerable delay generated substantial criticism. Indeed, Hitler advocated forming 300,000 troops to supplement the 6th German Army's ranks for combat within the Soviet Union as component of the renowned Operation Barbarossa. Following months of preparation, he succeeded in establishing the most formidable unit throughout the entire German military. According to Hitler's conceited convictions, the 6th Army possessed capability to assault the heavens themselves. In 1942, after unsuccessful interventions at Moscow, Sevastopol, and Leningrad, German forces directed attention toward Stalingrad territory. Despite ongoing German setbacks, the Führer, alongside his trusted advisors, assumed that following unexpected deployment, Soviet ranks would encounter shortages of military and morale supplies after countless losses sustained during the conflict's early years. Based on calculations performed by Nazi leadership within what became known as the Hunger Plan, populations of major Soviet cities would perish from starvation, reaching 35 million deaths. However, Hitler could not have been more mistaken. A gruesome and lethal engagement was about to commence. With roughly 275,000 German soldiers and just under 190,000 Soviet troops at the confrontation's onset, the Third Reich had positioned 3,000 artillery units, 500 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft. Conversely, the Soviet Union possessed merely 2,200 artillery pieces, 400 tanks, and 300 aircraft within Stalingrad. These figures would transform once the battle began. The systematic strategy commenced in early April through the designated Operation Blue, which entailed penetrating southern Russia to capture the Don and Volga river basins. This approach would enable German forces to eliminate Stalingrad's most significant industries, including its mechanical production facilities and railway communication networks. Upon completing these objectives, Hitler could command his troops toward the Caucasus oil fields. This proved essential as it allowed the Third Reich to secure adequate energy resources for subsequent war years. On June 1st, 1942, after some postponements, final preparations were completed for the major assault. And on June 28th, Operation Blue commenced. The beginning appeared favorable for Germany. Army Group South managed smooth advancement while Red Army ranks retreated eastward. 1 week later, units from German Army Group B progressed toward the Don River on both flanks of Voronezh city, engaging in fierce combat with opponents until achieving victory. Following the planned success, German forces continued toward their goal, advancing toward the Don River, Donets River, and subsequently toward the Volga River. On July 13th, following some unsuccessful decisions by the Führer, the Red Army managed recovery and prevented Germany from continuing to acquire Soviet territory. Weeks elapsed one after another, and Operation Blue began deteriorating for German troops. The Caucasus capture became a genuine failure. Adolf Hitler faced no alternative but to reconsider his tactics and modify his objectives. Following the failed choices of German ranks and the admirable achievements of Soviet soldiers, he decided to continue his route to Stalingrad and concentrate forces on that target. The strategy involved surrounding the city from north and south, then finally initiating the feared armored attacks. On August 19th, General Friedrich Paulus commanded the initial assault, and on August 23rd, hundreds of Heinkel 111 and Junkers 88 aircraft bombarded Stalingrad city. The following day, German panzers swept across the terrain and clashed with powerful Soviet tanks. However, the Red Army's reaction proved simply remarkable and inflicted terrible casualties upon the Third Reich. According to Colonel David Glantz, an authority on this conflict, the city battle had deteriorated into chaotic fighting, block by block and structure by structure, desperately slow, exhausting, and immensely expensive. Where German forces managed penetration, it occurred only from western and southern directions. Stalin's choice to defend the city deprived Germans of their conventional advantages in mobility, maneuver, and air and artillery support. It compelled them to breach Soviet defenses and engage in warfare resembling more the Somme or Verdun of 1916 than the Blitzkrieg of the preceding 3 summers. After 2 extended months of combat and enduring 3 German offensives, the fierce Soviet counterattack would emerge, making Adolf Hitler regret provoking Joseph Stalin and his mighty Red Army. Despite the casualties, the Soviet leader had managed to purchase time and design a flawless strategy to halt German troops. This served as the decisive turning point for World War II. This approach was designated the Cosmic Plan and comprised 5 operations: Uranus and Mars in southwestern and central front sectors, followed by Saturn and Jupiter, culminating with Operation Spark in the north. For this counteroffensive, Stalin deployed 2.5 million soldiers, over 13,000 artillery pieces, 4,000 tanks, and more than 1,000 aircraft. Germany, battered by its errors, possessed only 1.4 million soldiers, just over 10,200 artillery pieces, 500 tanks, and 700 aircraft. However, among all operations conceived by the Red Army, Uranus became the precedent-setting and most influential component of the Cosmic Plan. Led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov in the northern sector and Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky in the southern wing, Soviet ranks sought to drive enemy forces in the Don region westward, reclaim lost Stalingrad areas, and completely annihilate the German Sixth Army. The German side failed to anticipate the opponent's capability, which had adopted a doctrine known as maskirovka, meaning disguise in Russian. It involved military deception based on camouflage, fact manipulation, denial, deceit, and persuasion to influence both media and global opinion. This strategy included measures such as imitation, disinformation, decoys, dummies, and maneuvers to confuse the enemy. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched the brutal counteroffensive with thousands of massive bombardments, one after another, utilizing over 3,500 artillery pieces. After several weeks of massive attacks, Third Reich ranks found themselves cornered within Stalingrad fortress with no possibility of obtaining supplies or reinforcements. Germans suffered from extreme temperatures and starvation due to food shortages. They had no choice but to slaughter their draft horses to obtain pieces of edible meat. Due to freezing temperatures, they had to cut the horses using metal-specific tools. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, suggested to Hitler assisting the surrounded army with Junkers cargo planes tasked with supplying provisions dropped by parachute. Air General von Richthofen warned them that such an attempt would prove futile. With lack of aerial support, snowstorms, anti-aircraft fire, and enemy aircraft, only a small fraction of the trapped army could receive air supply. Despite the Third Reich's efforts to keep their soldiers alive, Thousands perished from starvation. Field hospitals became overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors were overwhelmed. A Soviet physician who entered a German hospital post-Battle of Stalingrad admitted witnessing several patients with craters on their faces. Soldiers suffering from chest, abdominal, and head wounds were left outside the hospital in the icy Soviet cold, as saving them proved impossible. Many attempted to board trucks heading to airfields for treatment, but military police rejected them without hesitation. Sadly, these soldiers froze to death as the German army lacked winter uniforms. Beyond injuries from fighting, typhus wreaked unimaginable devastation on German soldiers. It represents a disease transmitted by lice with symptoms including chills, vomiting, fever, rashes, pink eyes, dilated pupils, and black lips. Those contracting typhus required quick isolation to prevent further contagion. After suffering numerous casualties from this ailment, a new and mysterious death cause brought fresh problems to the Führer. Hundreds of German soldiers were dying suddenly without apparent reason. After a distinguished pathologist traveled directly from Berlin and conducted thorough analysis of numerous autopsy results, the enigma was revealed. The curious phenomenon was dubbed sudden death syndrome and resulted from cold, exhaustion, hunger, and despair. By late January 1943, Paulus requested authorization from the Führer to initiate negotiations with the Red Army. The outlook appeared entirely negative, and there seemed no choice but to make concessions and attempt survival. In response, Adolf Hitler did the unexpected. He promoted him to field marshal, reminding him that throughout Germany's history, no field marshal had surrendered. The situation had become irreversible. German soldiers withdrew from the advancing Soviet front. They inflicted wounds upon themselves, hoping to obtain passage home, and even exposed themselves from hiding places, hoping an enemy sniper would end their torment. Paulus grew indignant. He had grown weary of witnessing leaders enjoying comfortable conditions, feasting on delicacies and champagne while his men pleaded for dignified death. Furthermore, he could not comprehend that despite Soviets offering honorable surrender conditions, authorities adamantly refused accepting them. For that reason, Paulus did not oppose occupying the infamous position to which Hitler had brought him, and saw no alternative than signing the surrender. I see no escape from this hell. I still cannot grasp the concept of death, but that diabolical music of battle which brings death does not cease playing and playing, wrote an anonymous German soldier who likely died in his diary found on the Stalingrad front. Judging by interrogations of captured Germans, they had continued fighting despite hunger, exhaustion, and massive death from a mixture of resentment, obedience, and ideological conviction with National Socialism. Several prisoners displayed pro-Nazi sentiments such as their concern for blood purity and insisted on blaming Jews for the war, some without realizing their interrogator was Jewish. A particularly motivating factor, it added, was the fear of becoming prisoner. As Officer Ernst Jörn recounted, the idea spread that capture by Russians meant poor treatment, torture, and death. Although according to Jörn, until the final moment, most officers still hoped for outside assistance. Regarding surrender reasons, Lieutenant Hermann Stratmann refers to the lack of provisions, men, and artillery shells, and the fact that continuing combat became physically impossible for them. We were starving and most of us had frostbite. What a man can endure has limits, and we reached that limit. On February 2nd, we surrendered. Sergeant Helmut Piest pointed out that those final days were horrible. Thousands of corpses and wounded soldiers dying in streets, and on top of that we were receiving intense artillery and aerial fire from them. An anonymous soldier noted in his anguished diary describing the terrible cold, meager food rations and constant combat. Everyone's nerves are shattered. I have lost faith in humanity. An emotional letter to his father was written by this anonymous lieutenant, found in the book Dust of the Reich. Dear Father, the division has been cannibalized before the big battle, but the big battle will not happen. You may wonder why I'm sending you this letter to your workplace, but what I must tell you can only be said between men. You will pass it on to Mom in your own way. We were told that today we could write. For someone who knows our situation, that means this will be the last time we do so. You are a colonel, dear Father, and a member of the General Staff, so you understand what this means, and there is no reason for me to indulge in sentimentality. This is the end. I may possibly live for another week, but I believe that after that everything will be over. I do not want to seek reasons for or against our situation since, after all, they are useless and unimportant. But if I must say something, I will say this. Do not look to us for an explanation of the situation. Look within yourselves and at the man who is responsible for all this. Do not give up, Father, nor all those who think like you. Stay vigilant so that this great disaster does not engulf our homeland. The hell on the Volga River must be a warning to you, and I beg you not to ignore it. And now to the present. Of the entire division, only 169 useful men remain. Blau and Harley are still alive, but little Dieter lost both arms. He will probably return to Germany soon, so ask him about any details you wish to know. Naumann admitted he has lost all hope. Sometimes I wish I knew what he thinks about the situation and its consequences. We still have 2 machine guns and 400 usable cartridges, as well as a mortar and 10 rounds. Besides that, only hunger and fatigue. Without waiting to be ordered, Berg launched an attack with 20 more men. It's better to know how the end will come in 3 days rather than wait for 3 weeks. I can't blame him. Finally, on personal matters, you can be sure that everything will end for me in a respectable way, although it's a bit early at 30. I know, no hard feelings. I send a handshake to Lydia and Helen, a kiss to Mom. Be careful with her, Father. Think about her heart problems. A kiss to Gerhard and greetings to everyone else. The confrontation concluded for the Third Reich with roughly 1 million casualties, 900 demolished aircraft, and 500 tanks in identical condition. The defeat at Stalingrad, combined with other unsuccessful attempts to seize Soviet territories, signaled the commencement of what would become an elusive destiny for Germany in World War II. Meanwhile, the ordeal remained far from over for the nearly 100,000 survivors of the German army. Following confirmation of capitulation, an extended journey awaited them, unfortunately not leading them back home, but increasingly separating them from their families. The German soldiers who had managed to endure the Battle of Stalingrad were subjected to the horrifying Death March. This involved a heartbreaking trek through snow-covered paths, exposed to temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. Additionally, they were severely humiliated by their Soviet counterparts who tortured them both physically and verbally. They suffered from intentional hunger and dehydration. They fell ill with typhus, tuberculosis, malaria, dropsy, jaundice, diphtheria, scurvy, dysentery, among other ailments. This lethal march, which also included compulsory labor, lasted for extended weeks. Only 5,000 German troops managed to survive. The remaining soldiers died en route and could not enjoy dignified burial. Their bodies simply lay amidst the desolate Soviet steppes. The survivors did not experience better fortune. They were transported to Soviet labor camps better known as gulags, located in Lunova, Susal, Krasnogorsk, Bisk, Yelabuga, Usman, Asrian, Irank, Karaganda, and Banovsky, among others. The prisoners of war were considered by the Soviet Union not only as a labor source, but also as a resource to be utilized in the country's economy, not only during the war, but more importantly, in the post-war period, wrote historian Vladimir Vedyov. During the Tehran Conference, Stalin claimed to need more than 4 million German citizens to rebuild the destroyed Soviet cities and restore industry. According to historian Elena Shmaraeva, this figure was based on the identical number of Soviet soldiers killed and missing at the time of the International Convention. Simultaneously, during World War II, over 3 million citizens governed by Stalin were taken to Germany for forced labor. Everything indicates that what the Eurasian state sought was nothing less than to compensate for the damages received. To understand the suffering to which the German survivors of the Battle of Stalingrad were exposed, it is necessary to know the most chilling details about the gulags. The acronym Gulag refers to the main administration of corrective labor camps and colonies. It is the branch of the NKVD, that is, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union. This unit was responsible for directing the penal system of forced labor camps from its establishment in the 1930s until its dismantling in the early 1950s. The gulags housed over 14 million political prisoners and all types of criminals. At the beginning of World War II, approximately 2 million people were already residing in the gulags. This number increased significantly with the Soviet Union's entry into the war. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Stalin ordered the invasion and annexation of eastern parts of the Second Polish Republic. A year later, he occupied countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. Hundreds of thousands of citizens from these territories were arrested and sent to the gulags, even without having committed any crimes. There was no distinction to prevent a sentence in these camps. Minor offenses, jokes about the government, opinions or thoughts contrary to Stalinist ideology, cruel murders, all were sent to these establishments without hesitation. It is estimated that there were over 500 gulags throughout Soviet territory and even abroad. According to writer Anne Applebaum, the gulags did not emerge from nothing. They reflected the general level of society that surrounded them. If the camps were filthy, the guards brutal, the work teams negligent, it was in part because dirt, brutality, and neglect abounded in other spheres of Soviet life. After the start of the Second World War, the directors of the gulags created the term katorga, which referred to an extremely abusive labor system superior to what the rest of the prisoners had to tolerate. The ones responsible for these tasks were none other than the Nazi soldiers and collaborators for whom they held particular contempt. This means that the survivors of the Battle of Stalingrad were subjected to the most enslaving punishments. Many of them did not survive and died on the spot. A small group of soldiers who fought in the Russian fortress were sent to different work camps than the gulags, closer to the city. At the same time, other troops were sent directly to Stalingrad to carry out the arduous reconstruction tasks due to the staggering destruction caused during the conflict. It is necessary to revisit the tasks that captives had to perform in the gulags. Among the main activities were work related to gold, timber, nickel, tin, cobalt, iron, and chromium. They also had to manufacture weapons, ammunition, uniforms, airplanes, tanks, and railways. Prisoners had to work long hours without pay and lacked time for recreation. They only had between 4 and 5 hours to sleep. This latter aspect had serious consequences for productivity, but Stalin seemed uninterested. It was more important for him that contempt for life prevailed over their usefulness in labor service. Furthermore, the prisoners' food was scarce to non-existent due to the shortage of supplies that plagued Europe almost entirely. In 1941, after the German attack, the conditions of the camps deteriorated significantly. Food rations were reduced, and medical supplies began to run out. According to writer Galina Mikhailovna Ivanova, in the spring of 1942, the camps ceased to function. It was difficult to find people who could even collect firewood or bury the dead. Andrei Vyshinsky, the chief Soviet prosecutor, wrote in a memorandum that among the prisoners, there are some who are so ragged and lousy that they pose a health hazard to others. These prisoners have deteriorated to the point of losing any resemblance to humans. In the absence of food, they collect garbage and, according to some prisoners, eat rats and dogs. Aaron Makarov, a survivor of the Kolyma Gulag, testified about the hell he experienced in that camp. Sometimes you have to crawl along the path to the wagon with a log on your shoulders, specifically one that is heavy, damp, and made of hardwood like oak. You are bathed in sweat, your heart beats as if it is about to jump out of your chest, you breathe so hard that you start to pant like an overheated horse, and you start to think, let me break a leg, I would fall and the log would crush me, and that would be the end. No more suffering, it would all be over forever. Helmut Bohn, a German soldier, confessed that, until we reached the camp, the daily ration was a liter of liquid soup and 300 grams of hard bread. Those days we were ordered to cut firewood for the Russian field kitchen. They gave us a little hot tea for dinner. We, a dozen prisoners, were locked up in a goat pen, supervised by a young lieutenant from the Red Army. However, it is important to mention that the living conditions of convicts varied according to the Gulag. For example, in Balkhash, there were 3,000 non-political prisoners housed. While they were lightly supervised, they could walk at will. They had open barracks, mattresses, and pillows. They could even watch Western movies. However, these conditions were exceptional compared to those of other gulags. In Norilsk, they housed political prisoners and high-profile criminals. There, the Soviet authorities installed surveillance towers with machine guns and provided closed barracks. Prisoners in general were prohibited from having photographs of their loved ones and were only allowed to send one letter per year. On the other hand, inmates also held positions of responsibility in which they assumed great responsibilities. Some of them were camp guards and had to ensure the safety of their fellow inmates. In some exceptional cases, prisoners could be released early if they showed good performance. Occasionally, they had livestock farming courses and theatrical performances performed by the professional theater group of the gulags. It is estimated that between 1934 and 1953, more than 1 million people died within the gulags. This means that many of the survivors of the Battle of Stalingrad died before they could find freedom or the end of World War II. In 1941, the mortality rate was 6%. In 1943, the year German troops entered, the rate had reached 23%. After several months following the end of World War II in 1946, there were still over 240 labor camps in the Soviet Union, housing over 1 million prisoners. Over time, this number increased to nearly 4 million. However, around 70% of them had health problems. German prisoners of war, both sick and healthy, were assigned to labor battalions. Humiliated because of their crimes committed during the greatest war in history, former members of the Nazi forces were cruelly forced to rebuild factories, dams, railways, and ports. They also restored thousands of houses for civilians that had been destroyed, as well as homes exclusively designed for Ministry of Interior workers. Some of them worked in a glass factory located in a Moscow suburb called Litkorino. Others built an archives building in Krasnogorsk based on the project of the prestigious German architect Paul Spiegel. They were also responsible for logging and building roads and railways in remote and inaccessible areas. There were also those who collaborated in mineral extraction in the mines of the Don River Basin. There they extracted uranium, coal, and iron. In turn, hundreds of prisoners were responsible for the construction of Dynamo Moscow Football Club's stadium. In addition to using the services of soldiers who participated in the Battle of Stalingrad for all these tasks, the Soviets recruited various high-level German specialists for the restructuring of different industries. Thus, over 250 civil engineers, 220 electrical engineers, and over 110 doctors in physical sciences, technical sciences, and mathematics worked towards the reorganization of the state, led by Joseph Stalin. It is true that those with doctorate or university certificates enjoyed better conditions than those who had caused thousands of deaths in the Soviet stronghold. Not only did they live in the cities near the institutions where they worked, but they also received wages in German marks, something an average Nazi officer envied greatly. However, it is necessary to clarify that both workers and soldiers working in construction projects received minimal pay for their services. Privates received 7 rubles a month, while former senior officers received between 10 to 30 rubles every 30 days. However, any of these figures was meager. A liter of milk cost 2 rubles, and a pair of shoes reached 100 to 150. On the other hand, prisoners who did not have any special skills had to find a way to survive. The experiences lived in the post-war labor camps were not very different from those they had to endure while the Third Reich fought to dominate the world. According to prisoner Rudi Goldbrunner, at first we had to load 2 train wagons with wood during a work shift. Then the norm increased to 3 wagons. We were forced to work 16 hours a day, also on Sundays and holidays. We returned to the camp at 9 or 10 at night, but often did so at midnight. We received watery soup and fell asleep so that the next day at 5 o'clock in the morning, we would go back to work. According to Officer Heinrich Eichenberg, who also had to tolerate the hardships of the post-war period in Soviet lands, the stomach problem was above all. The soul and body were sold for a plate of soup or a piece of bread. Hunger ruined people, corrupted them, and turned them into animals. Stealing products from their own companions became a common thing. During 1946, the death rate increased compared to the previous year and approached 300,000 people. Despite many Germans continuing to be prisoners, some enjoyed the coveted freedom. In June 1945, the Soviets released about 200,000 sick and weakened prisoners. 2 months later, that number rose to 600,000. Those fortunate enough to return to German soil could not keep the money earned from their tasks. That's why they tried to buy provisions before it was taken from them. According to Wilhelm Lutz's testimony, who was repatriated in 1949, before returning home he acquired 6 kilograms of cookies, over 2,300 cigarettes, and 600 grams of tobacco. Despite being liberated, the transportation conditions were no different from those of a labor camp. Passengers received neither water nor food during the long days when trains crossed Soviet lands. Once on German soil, they were transferred to the Soviet relocation camp in Frankfurt, where the next 48 to 72 hours passed. Finally, the ranks of the Red Army sent them to their hometowns. The repatriation of German prisoners of war from Soviet lands officially ended in 1950. However, during the next 6 years, between 10,000 and 20,000 captives who had not been declared regularly were handed over. Additionally, what few know is that the Soviets created 10 special camps in Germany where they had approximately 176,000 prisoners. According to Karl-Heinz Friemel, who was imprisoned in the Torgau camp in Saxony, "We couldn't leave. We were 3 in each cell. They barely gave us food, and we had to kill time. At the end of the captivity, a third of the prisoners had died. Those who could emerge unharmed were prohibited from mentioning the conditions in which they lived in the camps, as they were accused of incitement and slander." After the fall of the German Democratic Republic, researchers discovered mass graves containing over 7,000 corpses. Regarding the convicts who labored in Stalin's gulags, according to official Soviet statistics published in 1956, over 2 million German prisoners were repatriated to Germany. However, some claim that these figures were manipulated and that the actual number was approximately 600,000. Another destiny befell Friedrich Paulus, the aforementioned field marshal at Stalingrad, as he endured truly desolate days after commanding the German army in this brutal battle. In 1943, after receiving Hitler's ultimatum pressuring him not to surrender, Paulus confessed to his subordinates, "He wants me to commit suicide, but I won't give him that pleasure." He then ordered one of his men to contact the Soviets to negotiate surrender. That same day, he was captured along with all his staff. After the defeat, Hitler organized a funeral in Germany on top of an empty coffin. He ordered Paulus's baton to be placed inside. In this way, he sought to declare the field marshal dead, who was still alive in Soviet territory. Upon learning of this situation, Stalin's close associates tried to persuade Paulus to abandon his convictions and cooperate against the Nazi state. During the summer of 1944, after refusing to betray Germany, Paulus received 2 devastating pieces of news. On one hand, the death of one of his twin sons. On the other, the execution of a large number of former comrades who conspired to defeat Hitler. After these events, Paulus decided to take action and collaborated with the Soviet Union to establish a new state direction that would end the war and restore peaceful and friendly relations with the current enemy. Thus, he joined the Free Germany Committee, initiated by the German Communist Party in Soviet territory. In 1946, Soviet leaders secretly brought Paulus to testify in the Nuremberg trials. His presence caused great astonishment in the courtroom, as Adolf Hitler himself had declared him dead. During the interrogation, Paulus stated that in early 1940, when he began working in the General Command Staff as head of logistics, he found, among other files, an unfinished operations plan regarding an attack on the Soviet Union. Thanks to his presence and testimony in the trial, the Soviet Union was able to demonstrate that the Third Reich had planned the attack beforehand. Thus, Nazi criminals had no chance of exoneration. In 1953, after being released along with other prisoners of war by Stalin's government, Paulus lived in the German city of Dresden. There he served as the civilian head of the Institute of Military Historical Research of the German Democratic Republic. During those years, he developed progressive bulbar paralysis, a form of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Friedrich Paulus passed away on February 1st, 1957. Another remarkable story was that of Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach. After being promoted to lieutenant general following his work in the Demyansk offensive operation, he was part of the 6th Army in Stalingrad alongside Paulus. Shortly before the end of the battle, Seydlitz was taken prisoner. During his captivity, Soviet officers noticed that he often spoke derogatorily about the Third Reich. For that reason, and upon Stalin's order, they tried to persuade him to join the group of German military personnel who wanted to overthrow Nazism. After agreeing, he began to persuade other German troops to join him. Upon learning of this situation, Hitler ordered him to be sentenced to death in absentia for his betrayal. Consequently, his relatives were persecuted and expelled from official positions. In 1943, Seydlitz was appointed president of the League of German Officers, composed of prisoners in Soviet hands. This entity depended on the National Committee for a Free Germany, the same one that Paulus was part of. The former lieutenant general's thirst for revenge was insatiable. He even proposed the creation of an anti-Nazi German army composed of German prisoners. Additionally, he attempted to plan an operation to gather paratroopers and drop them over Germany to initiate a communist partisan guerrilla. However, the Soviet authorities vehemently rejected all his proposals. Later, Stalin deemed the Officers' League to be utterly useless and re-imprisoned his comrades. After the war ended and faced with such disappointment, he refused to cooperate and in 1949 was sentenced to prison for the war crimes committed by his troops. 7 years later, Seydlitz was released and sent back to Bremen, his hometown. Although he sought to regain his rank and have his lifelong pension recognized, this was not possible. It wasn't until 1956 that the West German government annulled the sentences imposed by the Third Reich. Seydlitz died on April 28, 1976. Almost 20 years after his death, in 1994, his family succeeded in having the military courts of Russia annul the sentences imposed by the former Soviet Union. In the 1950s, Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd, which in Spanish means the city of the Volga. Beneath its new structures and buildings lies the bloodshed of a bloody war, which left millions dead and led to almost 100,000 troops ending up in the brutal Soviet gulags. After the war, many of them died under the most terrible conditions, while others managed to survive the ordeal and returned to their native Germany. However, none of them could avoid the judgments exercised by justice and the resentment of a citizenry that for the years to come sought peace and prosperity in their homes. In their prisons and in their graves, the men of Stalingrad hold the darkest stories of a battle that marked military history forever.